So this all started after Helen, my wife, cheated on me for the third time in a year. Yeah, third. You'd think I'd be numb to it by now, but each time hit like a truck. It's hard to say why I didn't walk away sooner. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or the thought of rebuilding a life without her. I know, I sound like a fool, but back then, I believed people could change. The first time Helen cheated on me was during what was supposed to be a relaxing getaway to Turkey. We'd been together 8 years by then, and I'd surprised her with a week-long trip to a 5-star resort on the coast. Sun, turquoise waters, endless food and drinks. Everything set for us to unwind, reconnect, leave work and the stress of everyday life behind. I've been putting in 60-hour weeks for months just to be able to afford it and take the time off, and we were both due for a break. The place was spectacular. From the moment we arrived, it felt like another world. The staff greeted us with cool towels and glasses of orange juice, and we were shown to a suite with a sweeping view of the sea. We settled in fast. Helen was already snapping photos and exploring every corner. She had this infectious enthusiasm, and it was one of the things I'd always loved about her. Now, I'd heard people talk about these resort romances before, the stories of people catching flirty vibes from the hotel staff or the bartenders, usually all in good fun and part of the charm. But I never expected Helen to become so friendly with the staff, especially so soon after we arrived. She was always sociable. I thought nothing of it as she struck up conversation with one of the pool attendants, a young guy named Sim. He was maybe mid-20s, tan and well-built, with this laid-back attitude and a knack for making people laugh. He must have seen Helen taking photos by the pool and came over to offer her a cocktail on the house. She laughed, flirted a bit in that harmless way, and when she called me over to meet him, he smiled and gave me a solid handshake. Nice enough guy, I thought. Over the next few days, Helen seemed drawn to the pool more than any other part of the resort. She'd say it was just to get some sun or have a swim, but there was always some nearby, ready to make small talk or bring her another drink. I didn't see anything wrong with it at first. After all, I had my own way of unwinding, sipping a beer in the shade or getting lost in my book. But after a while, her poolside hours became longer and longer. She'd be there well into the evening, well after the other guests had cleared out and the pool was quiet. I remember one evening, I went down to meet her for dinner after freshening up in the room. She'd said she'd be just a minute, and I was waiting on the sun deck, watching the sunset as I saw her talking to Sem again. She was laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm. It was subtle, but there was this energy, a little too much interest. It was our 5th night at the resort when I saw them together. Helen had spent most of the day sunbathing at the pool, and when I went down to check in on her around noon, she said she was feeling too tired for any plans. I suggested we spend the evening in our suite, maybe order room service, and watch a movie. She agreed, but she seemed distracted, her eyes flicking to her phone now and then. After a couple of hours, she said she wanted to go for a quick swim to clear her head. I didn't think much of it. She always enjoyed a late dip, and I figured I'd use the time to head down to the bar for a beer and catch part of the soccer match on TV. About an hour in, I realized she hadn't returned, and there was this weird feeling gnawing at me. I brushed it off, forced myself to focus on the game, but the unease wouldn't go away. When another hour passed, I decided to head back to the room. On the way, I texted her, "Where are you?" No answer. I tried calling, and it rang twice before going to voicemail. I didn't panic, but something felt off. I took the elevator up to our floor and walked down the hallway, my mind racing with a mix of worry and confusion. Maybe she'd gone back to the room without her phone. Maybe she'd bumped into one of the other couples we'd met earlier and lost track of time. But the closer I got to the door, the more I sensed something wasn't right. As I approached, I noticed the "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging on the handle. Strange, since we hadn't put it there earlier. I pushed the key card into the slot, the door unlocking with a soft beep. As I stepped inside, I was greeted by darkness. Only a sliver of light slipped through the curtains from the moonlit ocean outside. The silence was heavy, but then I heard it, a low, muffled laugh coming from the bedroom. Helen's laugh. It was unmistakable. My heart pounded as I stood there, paralyzed, but that sense of dread propelled me forward. I stepped lightly across the suite, drawn toward the sounds, each one slicing deeper than the last. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and as I peered in, there was no mistaking what I saw. Helen sprawled across the bed, her skin still glistening from the pool, tangled in the sheets. And there he was, Sim, positioned between her and the headboard, moving with a confidence and ease that told me this wasn't the first time. They hadn't noticed me yet, too caught up in each other to sense they were being watched. I must have stood there for a good 5 seconds, frozen as reality hit me. The shock numbed me at first, but then rage came crashing in. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat, a thunderous beat in my ears, fueling the anger rising up from somewhere I didn't even know existed. I slammed the bedroom door open, and that was when they both noticed me. Sam practically jumped off the bed like a kid caught stealing, his face wide-eyed, darting between me and Helen, scrambling to grab his clothes. Helen's reaction was different. She went pale, but didn't move a muscle. She just stared at me, a look of guilt mixed with defiance. "Are you kidding me, Helen?" My voice came out louder than I expected. "Are you actually doing this? Here? On our vacation?" "Listen, it's not," she stammered, wrapping herself in the sheets. But I wasn't about to let her finish, and I certainly wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. "Not what, Helen?" I snapped. "Not what it looks like. You think I'm blind? Or just stupid?" Sam muttered some apology in broken English, frantically pulling on his clothes. He looked like he was about to bolt, but seemed too terrified to move past me, as if he thought I'd pummel him on the way out. My fists were clenched so tightly that my knuckles went white, but somehow I held back, fighting every urge to throw him out of the window right then and there. "Get out," I snarled at him. He nodded, looking to Helen as if for permission, which only made my anger boil even hotter. After what felt like an eternity, he slipped past me and out the door, leaving Helen and me alone in the room. We sat in silence for a moment that felt like hours. She looked away, clutching the sheets to her chest, avoiding my gaze. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. She hesitated, then tried to find the words. It's complicated," she murmured. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It's just we've been so distant, and he—" "Don't. Just don't." I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear about what she thought she was missing or how some hotel worker had somehow filled a gap that I apparently hadn't. After a tense silence, she finally looked up at me. "What are you going to do?" I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts through the blinding anger. "What am I going to do? For one, I'm not leaving. I paid for this vacation, and I'm damn well staying until it's over. You can do whatever you want, but don't think for a second I'm about to run back home while you finish your little fling." The words hit her hard, and I could see the guilt clouding her face. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it. Good. There was nothing more I wanted to hear from her right now. We stayed in that room in strained silence until morning, neither of us saying another word. I couldn't bring myself to even look at her as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of betrayal suffocating me. But I wasn't about to let her ruin the whole trip. The next morning, I got up early, well before Helen stirred. I wasn't about to sit through an awkward breakfast with her, pretending things were fine, so I headed to the dining hall alone. My mind was racing, flipping between anger, sadness, and disbelief. Everything around me felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life, watching my marriage crumble in real time. By the time I returned to the room, Helen was gone. I didn't have to ask where she was, I knew. Every gut instinct told me she'd gone right back to him, and the thought of it twisted like a knife in my chest. I told myself I'd stick it out, that I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of knowing how much it was tearing me apart, but each passing minute, that resolve weakened. I spent the day wandering through the town, hoping to find something, anything, that would distract me. I walked the narrow streets lined with shops, browsed stalls at the local markets, and took in the stunning views along the beach, trying to lose myself in the scenery. But every beautiful sight only reminded me of why I'd come here in the first place, to make new memories with Helen. Now it felt like I was just trying to erase her from my mind. When I returned to the resort, I half hoped I'd find her waiting for me, remorseful, maybe ready to apologize or explain herself. But the room was empty, the bed neatly made. She hadn't been back. Hours later, just as dusk began to settle, she finally returned, the glow on her face unmistakable. She looked surprised to see me there, as if she'd expected the room to be empty. "Hey," she said almost casually, trying to gauge my reaction. I didn't say anything, just looked at her, letting the silence speak for itself. Without another word, she went to the bathroom, avoiding my gaze, and I heard the water running as she showered, as though washing away any trace of where she'd been. That night, we didn't speak. She slipped into bed beside me, and I lay there, stiff as a board, my mind racing. I thought she might try to say something, maybe even offer a half-hearted apology, but she said nothing, just turned away, her back to me, while I stared at the ceiling, my stomach churning. Over the next few days, she continued her routine as if nothing had happened. She'd spend her days lounging by the pool or disappearing to explore the town, which was just her excuse to see Sam. Each time, she'd come back to the room with that same faint glow, that same satisfied look, barely acknowledging me. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. It was like she'd fully settled into her role, as if her affair had somehow become her new reality, while I was just a forgotten part of her old life. One afternoon, I decided to sit by the pool, hoping I might find a moment of peace for myself, maybe even a distraction. But soon enough, I spotted her across the deck, reclining on a lounge chair, Sem leaning over her, pouring her a drink with a smirk on his face. They were laughing, close enough that anyone watching could see there was something between them. She must have felt my eyes on her, because she glanced over, her smile faltering just slightly when she met my gaze. But she didn't look away. I stared back, letting her see the anger and disappointment in my eyes. I wanted her to feel that pain, to understand the weight of what she was doing. But she just gave a tiny, defiant smile, as if daring me to react. Then she turned her attention back to Sem, clinking her glass against his in some private, twisted toast. When we got back from Turkey, it was as if Helen had decided to erase every trace of what had happened. She acted like nothing had changed, like we hadn't spent a week in silent war. She slipped back into our routines, humming as she made her morning coffee, chatting about work as if her fling with Sem had been nothing more than a bad dream. But for me, it was impossible to forget. I couldn't shake the memories of her with him, the way she'd laugh with him, look at him with that glow. It haunted me day and night, but every time I tried to bring it up, she'd brush it aside, insisting it was in the past, and that she wanted to move forward. She wanted everything to be just like it was. After a week of sleepless nights and strained silences, she sat me down in the living room, looking uncharacteristically serious. "Look, I know I hurt you," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I know I did something unforgivable, but I still love you, and I want to fix this." Her words hit me like a cold wave. It was the first real acknowledgement of her betrayal. Up until then, she'd avoided talking about it, as though ignoring it would make it vanish. Seeing her own regret, I softened a little, but I still wasn't convinced. "You think you could just say sorry, and that's it?" I said, voice trembling with anger and exhaustion. "It doesn't work like that, Helen. You broke something." She took my hand, her expression pained, searching for something in my eyes. "Then let me fix it. Let's go to a counselor or a psychologist, whatever it takes. I want to do this right. I'll prove to you that I want us to be okay." That was the first time she'd ever suggested anything like therapy, and part of me wondered if it was just another excuse. But I was tired, too tired to keep fighting alone, and maybe a part of me still held on to the hope that the woman I'd fallen in love with was still somewhere in there. So, I agreed. We started couples therapy the following week. Our therapist, Dr. Lindstrom, was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a calm presence that seemed to diffuse the tension in the room. At first, I could barely bring myself to speak in those sessions. Every time I opened my mouth, the anger threatened to pour out. Helen, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved to have someone to talk to, as if she could finally put all her justifications and regrets into words without facing my judgment. Over the course of a few months, the sessions helped us unearth a lot of issues we'd never addressed before. I admitted how lonely I'd felt in our marriage, constantly working to keep up with her expectations. She confessed how she'd struggled with feeling trapped in routine, looking for excitement wherever she could find it. It didn't make anything easier, but understanding the cracks that had formed over the years was a start. Slowly, I felt myself begin to let go of some of the resentment. Helen seemed genuine in her efforts, constantly going out of her way to be open with me, to show me that she was done with her old ways. She'd ask me every day how I was feeling, make more of an effort to spend time together, take an interest in my hobbies. It was like she was a different person, or maybe she was just trying to rebuild the trust she'd shattered. One evening, months after that disastrous trip, she surprised me with a weekend away, just the two of us, at a cabin she'd booked out in the mountains. It was simple, no luxury, just nature, the quiet, and each other. We sat by the fireplace, drank wine, and talked late into the night. For the first time, I saw a glimpse of the Helen I'd married. The one who'd laughed at my jokes, stayed up with me talking about the future. The one I'd thought I'd lost forever. By the end of that weekend, I finally found myself saying the words I never thought I'd be able to say. I forgive you. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't the kind of forgiveness that comes with forgetting. But I wanted to try, to give us a chance to rebuild what she'd torn apart. Helen promised she would never put me through that again, that she'd make things right between us. And for a while, it felt like we were actually healing, starting over. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that things could go back to the way they were. 6 months after that trip to Turkey, just when things were finally beginning to feel stable again, Helen betrayed me in a way I could never have predicted. And it wasn't with some stranger or a fleeting fling. It was with Dr. Lindstrom, our therapist, the man who was supposed to be helping us patch up the pieces of our marriage. It started subtly. Helen would come home after our therapy sessions in a strangely good mood, more animated and talkative than usual. She'd mention Dr. Lindstrom often, bringing up his advice with this newfound enthusiasm, as if she had discovered something profound. I noticed how she'd light up whenever she talked about him, recounting moments from our sessions, quoting his words like they were revelations. I chalked it up to her actually investing in the therapy. I even felt a sense of relief that she seemed dedicated to making things work. If anything, I thought it was a sign that things were finally improving. But then, her enthusiasm started crossing lines. She began bringing him up in casual conversation outside the context of therapy. I'd make an offhand comment about work stress, and she'd respond with, Dr. Lindstrom once said that stress can really cloud your thinking, or she'd give these little nuggets of advice that clearly weren't her own. At first, it just felt strange, like she was idolizing him. But then, the frequency of his mentions started to raise red flags. One evening, I overheard her on the phone, talking in this soft, hushed tone. At first, I thought maybe she was speaking to a friend, someone she could confide in about all the stress we'd been through, but the tone was far too intimate for that. When I walked into the room, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was her sister on the other line. The next week, she asked if we could do individual sessions with Dr. Lindstrom, just for a few weeks, she said, to get a fresh perspective on our own issues. I was hesitant, not understanding why she'd need private sessions, but I agreed. After all, our therapy had been helping, and if she felt individual sessions would keep us on the right path, who was I to question it? But as the weeks went on, I started noticing more. She'd be out for hours on end, her excuses for the late nights becoming flimsier by the day. I'd ask her where she'd been, and she'd respond with a dismissive, "Oh, I just went for a drive to clear my head," or "I needed some alone time after the session." One night, she didn't come home until nearly midnight, and when I confronted her, she claimed she'd lost track of time talking with Dr. Lindstrom after the session. Dr. Lindstrom? Talking that late? I asked, eyebrows raised. "Oh, you know how deep conversations can get," she replied with a nonchalance that only fueled my suspicions. It was becoming too much to ignore. So, one evening, after her solo session, I decided to check her phone. I knew it was a breach of trust, but at that point, trust had become a brittle, laughable concept. I waited until she fell asleep, then slipped her phone from the nightstand, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. My stomach dropped as I saw the messages. There were dozens of them, all from Dr. Lindstrom. They started innocently enough, but as I scrolled up, the messages turned into flirtations and then crossed into things I hadn't even seen between us in years. Messages about their connection, about the special bond they developed through therapy. They spoke about their stolen moments together, inside and outside the therapy office. One message was particularly damning. "I can't wait until our next session, Helen. You have no idea what you do to me." In that moment, I felt every ounce of trust, every bit of forgiveness I'd built up over the past 6 months, come crashing down. As I scrolled through the messages, the situation turned from betrayal to something far more sickening. Mixed in with the flirtations were photos, pictures Helen had taken, wearing lingerie I'd never seen before. I couldn't help but stare, feeling equal parts fury and heartbreak. In some of the photos, she was posed in front of our bedroom mirror, wearing a deep red lace set that clung to her body in a way I knew wasn't for me. There was even one taken in the shower, a fogged-up mirror revealing her silhouette in the background. And then I saw a message that made my blood run cold. I bought a new set just for you. Let me know what you think. Dr. L, winky face with a photo attached of her holding up a delicate black lace bra and matching underwear. The kind of set that she'd never worn for me, not in all the years we'd been together. Dr. Lindstrom's reply was right beneath it. Helen, you look absolutely breathtaking. I think we'll need an extra session just to see that set in person. There were more photos, a lot more. Some taken in the therapy office itself, under his dim office lights, her lips pursed, hair tousled, wearing the very clothes she'd left the house in that morning. She'd taken one from behind, her head turned to the side with a look that made me feel like an intruder in my own marriage. It was a side of Helen I hadn't seen in years, a side I thought she'd outgrown. And she was sharing it with him. Him, our therapist, the man who was supposed to be helping us repair what she'd already broken once. My mind raced as I read on. I found messages where they planned their sessions carefully to avoid raising suspicion. She'd even suggested cover stories in case I became curious. In one exchange, she'd written, I'll say we're doing extra individual therapy sessions, that he suggested it to help me open up. And he'd replied, perfect. Keep him focused on that. It'll give us all the freedom we need. They'd orchestrated it all. They'd used the therapy, my effort to forgive and repair, as their own twisted cover to carry on this sordid affair. I couldn't let this go unanswered. My hands were steady with a determination I hadn't felt in months. As Helen's phone was unlocked, I switched to the video camera, hit record, and stared straight into the lens, letting every ounce of anger, betrayal, and disgust pour out. Well, Dr. Lindstrom, I began, my voice cold and controlled. This is Helen's husband, the man who thought he was actually fixing his marriage with your professional help. I let out a bitter laugh, feeling the betrayal weigh heavier with each word. I know all about your sessions with my wife, the photos, the messages, everything. It ends here. You're going to stop this. And if I so much as hear a rumor about you two again, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. I paused, holding the phone up to catch every grimace and tight-lipped glare, then continued. If you've got a scrap of professional dignity left, you'll walk away, delete every trace of her, and forget you ever met her. I suggest you consider what you're risking, your reputation, your license, and whatever respect you thought you had as a professional. Don't test me. With that, I stopped recording and, without a second thought, hit send. The message whooshed away, disappearing into the digital ether, and the weight of what I'd done settled in. I closed her phone, placed it back on the nightstand, and leaned back on the bed, waiting. Not 5 seconds later, I heard the sound of the shower turn off, and Helen emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, hair wet and dripping down her shoulders. She froze when she saw me, her expression shifting from casual surprise to that faint, nervous look I'd seen one too many times in Turkey. What's going on? She asked, an edge of apprehension in her voice. I didn't answer immediately. I just looked at her, studying the face of the woman who had promised to change, who had begged for forgiveness and then tossed it aside as if it meant nothing. The same woman who had just a moment ago been standing in front of me, but really, she'd been a stranger for a while now. Oh, nothing much, I replied, voice heavy with sarcasm. Just had a quick chat with Dr. Lindstrom. Her face went pale. She stammered, clutching the towel tighter around herself. Well, what do you mean? I nodded toward her phone on the nightstand. I sent him a message, a video message, actually, told him we both know exactly what's been going on. She gasped, one hand flying to her mouth as she processed the reality of what I'd done. Her eyes darted to her phone, then back to me, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to come up with a response. You had no right. She finally managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. Oh, I had every right, I shot back. You had no right to turn our therapy into your own little love affair. Do you even realize what you've done? Helen? To us? To me? She started shaking her head, her mouth still open, but no words came. The mask had slipped, and for the first time, she looked truly terrified. Forgiving her the second time took every ounce of resolve I had left. After what happened with Dr. Lindstrom, I thought for sure I was done. The betrayal was deeper, sharper, cutting through every last shred of trust I'd tried so hard to rebuild. But Helen, as before, broke down, apologizing, pleading with promises to change, to make things right. For days, she wouldn't leave me alone, texting, calling, even writing letters, doing anything to convince me she was sincere. She swore up and down that she'd made a mistake, that she'd gotten caught up in the intimacy of therapy and let her emotions cloud her judgment. She begged me to give her one last chance, said she'd do anything it took to prove herself, to make things right between us. It was only after 2 weeks of near-constant pleas that I finally caved and agreed to see a new therapist. This time, I made sure to choose someone completely different, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Murphy. She came highly recommended, and I was hopeful that her guidance would give us the objectivity we needed. If nothing else, I needed someone who wasn't going to be yet another temptation for Helen. Dr. Murphy was a no-nonsense type. She didn't waste time with pleasantries or soft words, getting straight to the heart of things from the very first session. She challenged Helen, calling her out on her actions and making her confront the damage she'd caused. She asked her why she kept seeking attention and thrills outside of our marriage, forced her to dig deeper than any therapist had before. It was raw, uncomfortable, but I could see Helen wrestling with her own choices, maybe for the first time. One session in particular stood out to me. Dr. Murphy looked at me, her expression thoughtful. "Have you shown Helen that you value her? I mean, truly value her outside of these recent betrayals? Or has your focus been on protecting yourself?" I was taken aback. I thought I'd been doing everything right, working long hours, trying to provide stability, even forgiving her after 2 betrayals. But Dr. Murphy's words lingered. She encouraged me to be more expressive in the way I showed love, to move past emotions of forgiveness and actively create positive experiences, to build something new. So, I gave it a shot. I bought Helen flowers for the first time in years, brought home her favorite lilies and roses, and watched as she blinked in surprise, then beamed at me. I took her on dates again, just like we'd done when we were younger. Expensive dinners, weekends at luxury hotels, surprise gifts I knew she'd love. For a while, it felt like we were falling back in love. She, too, was putting in effort, not just saying the right things but acting on them. She'd cook my favorite meals on a whim, make time to go on long walks with me after work, even plan weekends away where it was just us, cut off from the outside world. After a few months, we were finally back on solid ground. I was cautiously optimistic. We'd worked hard to get here, and even though I still had lingering doubts, I couldn't deny the progress we'd made. For the first time in a long time, we were a team again, and this time, I thought we might actually be able to keep it that way. I'd hoped, maybe foolishly, that the worst was behind us. The third time Helen cheated, it blindsided me in ways I didn't think were possible after everything we'd been through. I'd done my part. I'd forgiven, rebuilt, and tried to love her the way she'd always wanted. But somehow, that wasn't enough. It started subtly, almost innocently, the way it always does. This time, it was with someone in our own social circle. Jake, the husband of my friend Laura. We'd known them both for years, often met up for weekend barbecues, went on the occasional double date, and even spent holidays together once or twice. They were close to us, practically family, which made what happened all the more devastating. Helen and Laura had always gotten along, even considered each other best friends. They would talk for hours over wine, laughing about silly things their husbands did, or sharing personal stories from work. Jake was easygoing, a laid-back guy with a dry sense of humor and the kind of charm people naturally warmed up to. I never felt threatened by him. If anything, he was one of the few people I trusted without a second thought. The first red flag came one evening after we'd all had dinner together. Laura had gone to bed early with a headache, and Helen and I were about to leave when Jake pulled Helen aside to show her something on his phone. I stood back, giving them space, figuring it was nothing more than some funny meme or video he'd saved for her. But I noticed the way they leaned in close, whispering to each other, laughing softly while I waited at the door. On the way home, I mentioned it to Helen, half joking. "You and Jake seem pretty chummy back there. Something I should know." She laughed it off, rolling her eyes. "Oh, don't be silly. He was just showing me something dumb. You know how he is." She reached over and gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. "Besides, I'm all yours. Remember?" I tried to let it go, telling myself I was just being paranoid after everything that had happened. But over the next few weeks, Helen started mentioning Jake more often. She'd laugh about something funny he'd said, or comment on some shared interest they'd discovered. She even started helping Laura and Jake plan a big anniversary party, taking on an unusual level of responsibility for the event. There was one night, in particular, that stood out. Helen and I had been out for a date night, and on the way home, she casually suggested stopping by Jake and Laura's place. I just want to check on a few things for the party, she said a bit too breezily. It was late, but I didn't argue. I parked outside while she ran up to the house, figuring it would be a quick visit. But as I waited, time dragged on. 15 minutes became 30, and I sat there, watching the lights in the front windows flicker on and off. Finally, I texted her, "Everything okay in there?" She replied a minute later, just going over details with Jake. "Be right out." Something in my gut twisted. I'd seen this pattern before, that mix of casual secrecy, the same as she'd shown in Turkey and with Dr. Lindstrom. My patience finally wore thin, and I got out of the car, heading toward the front door. Just as I was about to knock, I heard their voices inside, laughter mixing with whispers. The sound was too familiar, too intimate. I leaned in closer, listening through the door, catching snippets of their conversation. Things I knew should never be exchanged between a friend's wife and husband. I was frozen outside, the weight of reality sinking in. But before I could react, the door opened, and there was Helen, surprised to see me standing there. She had that guilty look in her eyes, the one she'd tried to hide with a quick, forced smile. "Hey, sorry, Jake just had a lot of ideas," she said, brushing her hair back nervously. Jake appeared behind her, giving me a friendly nod, oblivious or pretending not to notice the tension. "Sorry for the wait, man," he said, completely at ease. "Just wanted to make sure we got all the details nailed down." But I could see something else in his expression, a flicker of something just beneath the surface, something that reminded me all too well of the looks I'd seen on Sam and Dr. Lindstrom. The third time I actually caught Helen cheating was burned into my memory in a way the other two never had been. It was almost as if I could feel it coming, like a dark cloud gathering over our lives. I'd noticed Helen was spending more and more time with Laura and Jake under the pretense of party planning, but it was clear from her demeanor that there was something else going on. One evening, a week before the party, Helen mentioned she'd be heading over to Jake and Laura's place again, this time alone. She assured me Laura would be there, that she just needed a little extra help with the final touches. I gave her a nod and feigned indifference, pretending to buy the story, but my suspicions were stronger than ever. After she left, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I got into my car and drove over to Jake and Laura's, parking a few houses down so Helen wouldn't see me if she happened to look out a window. The lights were on, and as I approached, I felt my heart racing. I didn't want to be right about this, but something deep down told me I already was. I went around the side of the house, where Jake's office was. I remembered Laura complaining once about how his office had French doors that opened to the backyard, how she hated the lack of privacy, but Jake had insisted he liked the view. I figured if they were in there, I'd be able to see without being seen. I crept up close, peering through a small gap in the curtains. And there they were. Jake stood near his desk, his hands resting on Helen's shoulders, his face relaxed, almost smug. But what struck me like a punch to the gut was Helen herself, kneeling in front of him, her head bowed as she performed an act that left nothing to the imagination. She wasn't just unfaithful. She was unfaithful in the most degrading, intimate way possible. She knelt there, completely absorbed, as if I didn't even exist, as if every promise she'd ever made to me was just a lie she'd whispered to keep me around. I felt my hands shake, felt my whole body freeze as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. It was like some sick, twisted movie that I couldn't turn off. Jake's face showed no shame, no guilt. He looked down at her with a possessive gleam, his hand stroking her hair as if she belonged to him, not me. That night, after I saw them through that damn window, I was done. I did my limit. All the forgiveness, the second chances, the promises. I couldn't keep lying to myself that any of it mattered to her. I drove back home, numb, my mind barely processing what I'd just witnessed. It was the image of her on her knees in front of him, the way she looked up at him with this trust, this affection, like she'd erased everything we'd been through together. By the time she got home that night, I'd packed my bags and was halfway out the door. She walked in, smiling faintly, maybe expecting the usual. A few questions, a short talk to ease my suspicions, then life back to normal. But the moment she saw the suitcase, the color drained from her face. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw you, Helen." My voice was flat, cold. "Tonight, at Jake's. I saw everything." The shock in her expression, the sheer horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She knew there was nothing she could say that would undo what I'd seen. And that, somehow, only hurt more. Oh, God. She finally managed to gasp, covering her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. It wasn't. I didn't. Her words trailed off, realizing that nothing she could say would make it any better. I turned to leave, suitcase in hand. I'm done, Helen. I can't do this anymore. You've lied, broken every promise you've made. Whatever you want, it's clearly not me. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm, her face contorted with desperation. No, please, she begged, her voice choked with sobs. Please don't leave. I'll do anything. I know I messed up, I know. I'll do whatever it takes. Just give me one more chance. One more. I swear. I'll fix this. I stared at her, feeling the cold, raw anger simmering just beneath my calm. You think I can just forgive this again, Helen? After everything? I shook my head, prying her hands off me. I've given you every chance, every opportunity to fix things, to rebuild what you broke. And each time, you took that trust and threw it away. But she wouldn't let go. She dropped to her knees, clinging to my hand, her face wet with tears. Please, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I know I've hurt you. I'll go to therapy, real therapy. I'll do whatever it takes, please, just don't leave me. I can't lose you. I wanted to say no, to just turn and walk out, but there was something in her desperation that made me hesitate. Maybe it was the years we'd spent together. Maybe it was some deeply buried hope that the woman I'd loved was still in there, waiting to come back. Against every ounce of logic, against my own instincts, I relented. Fine, I said, my voice heavy with resignation. One last chance. But this is it, Helen. If you betray me again, it's over. The relief in her eyes was instant, as if she'd been granted a reprieve she hadn't deserved. She nodded quickly, promising 1,000 things, swearing she'd make it right. I felt numb. Barely hearing her, she went on about finding a new therapist, a real one this time. I'd heard it all before, but for some reason, I let her pull me back in. So we started therapy again. This time, it was with Dr. Emily Radcliffe, a clinical psychologist who came highly recommended, known for her strict approach to couples counseling. Dr. Radcliffe didn't mince words. She held us accountable, calling out Helen's betrayals, as well as my own decision to stay in a relationship that had already been shattered. She forced Helen to confront the choices she'd made, to dig deeper than ever to understand why she kept seeking validation outside our marriage. It was raw, painful, but she stuck with it, showing a kind of commitment I hadn't seen in years. During one of our therapy sessions, Dr. Radcliffe leaned forward, her gaze steady but thoughtful. We were deep in yet another exhausting discussion about Helen's past infidelities, dissecting each painful event, when Dr. Radcliffe paused and looked at me with that penetrating, clinical stare. You know, sometimes people have a higher need for love and validation than others, she said, glancing at Helen, then back at me. In cases like Helen's, it's not always about not loving you. It's about feeling loved by many. I felt the weight of her words hit me, as if she'd just revealed some strange, twisted truth about my wife that I was supposed to accept. I glanced at Helen, who was nodding, like Dr. Radcliffe had just unlocked some deep mystery within her. You see, that's exactly what I mean, Helen said, her voice full of a conviction I hadn't heard before. It's not that I don't love you. It's that I need more love, more affection. I've always felt that, you know, and maybe that's why I held up a hand, feeling the frustration build. You're saying that I should just accept this? That your need for more is a reason for all this? Dr. Radcliffe interrupted gently. I'm not suggesting you simply accept it as it is, but rather that you understand this as a part of her nature. If you two are committed to staying together, then perhaps it's a conversation about redefining your relationship, setting boundaries that respect both of your needs. I looked over at Helen, expecting some kind of remorse or shame. But instead, there was a glint of excitement in her eyes, as if she'd been waiting for an opening. She reached over, grabbing my hand in a way that felt oddly formal. What if we tried something different, she suggested. An open marriage. It wouldn't be cheating if we both agreed to it, right? I mean, I could see other people, but I'd always come back to you. And you could date too, she added, almost as an afterthought. If that's what you wanted. I felt a surge of anger rise in me. But Dr. Radcliffe remained calm, watching our reactions as if we were part of some psychological experiment. Helen's face was earnest, as though this suggestion was the key to saving us, rather than a desperate attempt to have her cake and eat it too. You really think that's the answer? I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. After everything, you think the solution is just to make it official? So you can go on more dates and just call it open? Helen squeezed my hand, her voice softer, almost pleading. Think about it. It wouldn't be like before. There wouldn't be any lies. We could have rules, boundaries, and I'd be honest with you completely. It could work. Dr. Radcliffe nodded, her expression neutral. Sometimes, unconventional relationships do provide the structure couples need to meet their needs honestly. But this is not something to take lightly. You both need to carefully consider what it would mean for your marriage and your own boundaries. Helen was looking at me with a glimmer of hope, as if this arrangement would finally allow her to satisfy her craving for excitement without hurting me in the process. It felt like I was standing at the edge of some cliff, staring down at a path I didn't recognize, but I could see the expectation in her eyes. She wasn't going to stop asking for this, and I realized that, in her mind, this was her solution. Against every instinct, I finally agreed to Helen's proposal. After months of agonizing over the possibility of losing her or pushing her to betray me again, I was at my breaking point. She wanted an open marriage, and I wanted her to stay. So, I gave in. The beginning was surreal, to say the least. Helen wasted no time exploring. She'd come home after work, her face alight with the excitement of new flirtations and possibilities. At first, it was subtle. She'd mentioned someone from the gym, a guy from her book club, or a new colleague at work. But soon it grew more obvious. She started dressing differently, more provocatively, even for a quick trip to the store. Her phone would light up constantly with messages, and she'd smile, glancing at me like she was daring me to ask about it. I couldn't bring myself to. I'd agreed to this, hadn't I? So I kept my silence, even as the silence became its own kind of pain. The first time she went on a date, she didn't even bother to hide her excitement. I'll just be out for a few hours, she said casually, as if it were no different from meeting a friend for coffee. She dressed up in a way I hadn't seen her do in years. Tight black dress, high heels, a touch of red lipstick. She looked stunning, and for a brief moment, I almost convinced myself it was for me. But when she came home that night, there was a new energy to her, a glow that didn't come from anything I'd given her. She slipped into bed beside me, and without a word, I knew where she'd been and what she'd done. We lay in silence, the space between us growing with every minute, until she finally whispered, "It's nothing, you know, just a fling. I always come back to you." I nodded, swallowing the bitterness in my throat. "I know," I replied, though the words tasted like lies. The months went on, and I watched as Helen seemed to find a new happiness in this arrangement. She'd leave for her dates once or twice a week, each time with a different guy, each time with the same excitement. Sometimes she'd tell me about them afterward. Her face lit up like she was sharing a funny story. I'd nod, forcing a smile, pretending it didn't cut me every time. People would ask why I hadn't gone on dates myself, why I wasn't exploring this freedom the way Helen was. But the truth was I didn't want anyone else. I loved Helen, even if loving her meant accepting this new version of our relationship. It felt like I was losing pieces of myself each time she went out, like I was sacrificing a part of my dignity just to keep her happy. Sometimes, after she'd come home from a date, she'd be in a strangely affectionate mood, almost clingy. She'd curl up next to me on the couch, wrap her arms around me, whisper that I was the one she truly loved. And in those moments, I'd feel a strange mixture of relief and resentment. I was the one she'd always come back to, but I wasn't the one she wanted when she was out there seeking whatever it was she needed. I tried to be what she needed, tried to fill the spaces I thought might keep her satisfied. Flowers, gifts, surprise dates, anything to remind her of us. And for a while it seemed to work. She'd seemed touched, even sentimental, but it was like watching her live two lives. One with me, steady and reliable, and one outside our home, where she could be free, chasing thrill after thrill. And I stayed because I loved her. I accepted her as she was, no matter how much it hurt. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. New cheating wife stories tomorrow.